In the Galwan Valley in the western Himalayas, right at the heart of the disputed border between India and China, Indian and Chinese soldiers clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, using whatever they could get their hands on: sticks, stones, makeshift daggers, and raw physical force. For hours, Indians and Chinese fought to the death. The result? 20 Indian soldiers and at least 4 Chinese soldiers lost their lives in savage combat, all triggered by a disagreement over the construction of a road on the Indian side of a territory disputed for more than half a century. Shortly afterward, in September 2020, the first warning shots were fired in an area that had not heard gunfire since the last war between both countries in 1967. Everything seemed to be hanging by a thread, but what no one expected was what would happen just 5 years later. Now it's 2025 and everything has changed. The same country that not long ago was counting corpses on the banks of a frozen river is now smiling at a summit hosted by Beijing. Modi and Xi Jinping shake hands, praise each other, and speak of a shared future. Modi arrives in China for the ESCO summit, his first visit in 7 years. India participates actively in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, and it does so at the highest level. Modi not only attends, but also takes the spotlight. He greets Putin, listens carefully to Xi Jinping, and shows himself as though that entire past of tensions and skirmishes had never existed. It's the right choice for both sides to be friends, to have good neighbors and friendly ties. As long as they keep the broader framework of being partners, not rivals, China-India relations can remain stable and advance in the long term. Meanwhile, alarms are going off in Washington, because India, the partner the West considered key too. Containing China in the Indo-Pacific is now cozying up to the China-Russia bloc, and this time, it's not just a symbolic gesture or mere diplomacy. We're talking about the world's largest buyer of discounted Russian oil, and the player that could tip the balance of power in the East if it decides to join the other team. Along the way, India has also become one of the countries most punished by Donald Trump's tariffs. The reason? Exactly what we just said. Taking advantage of turmoil to buy Russian oil and weapons at bargain prices. Trump's 50% tariff on India went into effect just as Modi was calling for self-reliance. India feels betrayed by the United States, punished with 50% tariffs, making it the first country to suffer a sort of secondary sanction against Russia. What Trump apparently didn't count on, and if he really didn't. That's clumsiest that such a heavy-handed move would have direct consequences, pushing India even further away from the US and closer to those who don't give them so many problems or ask so many questions. Who would have thought? It seems we've lost India and Russia to the deepest, darkest China. May they have a long and prosperous future together. Imagine the scene. 20 world leaders listening to Xi Jinping talk about a multipolar world without US hegemony. And right there in that room, India smiles at Beijing, buys from Moscow, and carries a sense of betrayal from Washington, the very country that needs it as a pillar of its Indo-Pacific strategy. Friends, the real question is no longer whether Modi is playing multiple sides, but how far he plans to go. What explains this apparent shift? Is it a real change in India's foreign policy, or just a move to pressure the United States? And what would it mean if the world's largest democracy moved closer to a bloc led by China and Russia? One thing is clear. If India truly pivots toward China and Russia, the geopolitical, economic, and financial consequences will be enormous. Now, let's return to India's eastward tilt. The new order has arrived. For over 20 years, India enjoyed a truly privileged relationship with the United States. While Washington rolled out the red carpet, Modi smiled, and both sides talked about the Indo-Pacific as if it were a joint project for the future. Examples: joint military exercises in the Indian Ocean, intelligence sharing agreements, billion-dollar sales of drones and next-generation fighter jets, and even VIP invitations for India to sit at the G7 table, the table of the great powers, as a strategic partner. It was more than a friendship. It was almost a romance. But like in any complicated relationship, there comes a moment when one side gets tired of giving in. And now it seems India is the one saying, enough is enough. Looking back, New Delhi has made plenty of concessions to Washington again and again. For example, when Trump criticized the BRICS efforts to create an alternative currency, New Delhi quickly distanced itself, saying it had no interest in that plan. When Trump complained about Indian tariffs on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, Modi lowered them within weeks. When Trump threatened anyone targeting U.S. tech companies, India rolled back its digital services tax, one concession after another. And in New Delhi, the feeling was, after so much obedience, the least they deserved was special treatment. Tariff pressure. Fine, but with a final agreement like the EU, Japan, or South Korea had. Humiliation, but collective, like the others. Misery loves company. In fact, by July, it seemed a deal was within reach. Trump even publicly announced it until the cold shower of the 50% tariff hit. And you might be wondering, what on earth did India do to make Washington so angry? Well, according to Trump, it kept tariffs too high on U.S. products, a claim we've seen him use before. But above all, it was Russian oil. Since the invasion of Ukraine, India's purchases of Russian crude have skyrocketed. If in 2021 they accounted for barely 3% of India's oil imports, by 2024 they had reached 40%. In a short time, India became Moscow's biggest customer. And of course, Washington doesn't like that one bit. Indian officials tried to argue that it was about stabilizing global energy markets. That was the official line, even stated by India's petroleum minister. A creative excuse, but hard to swallow, because the numbers don't lie. India now buys about $50 billion in Russian crude each year that has about 3% of global oil trade. Not nearly enough to stabilize global markets. But the juiciest part isn't what India consumes, it's what it resells. India buys cheap thanks to Russian discounts born of Western sanctions, refines the oil, and then exports it. The result? Its sales of petroleum products doubled in record time. From $40 billion in 2018 to over $80 billion between 2022 and 2024. That kind of growth can be explained by domestic demand alone. This is business, pure and simple, and Washington knows it. Yet fuel prices inside India haven't gone down. Since 2022, they've kept rising. So much for energy security. The truth is, India is lining its pockets reselling discounted Russian oil, while Moscow maintains revenues despite Western isolation. And friends, that's exactly what seems to annoy Donald Trump. Maybe because India is buying oil from Russia, maybe because it isn't buying it from him. Either way, he's clearly upset. Trump's 50% tariff on Indian exports threatens $87 billion in trade. Experts warn of short-term pain, but long-term resilience. Textiles, leather, seafood, chemicals all in the crosshairs. The direct consequence, a real risk of massive job losses in India, and not in just any sector, but in the most labor-intensive ones. The good news is that electronics, smartphones, and pharmaceuticals are safe for now. Still, Modi has an uncomfortable dilemma on the table: obey Washington and swallow the economic hit, or find new friends to give him breathing room and who's waiting with open arms. Exactly Russia and China. But let's not fool ourselves. A full pivot to China would be extremely complicated. Too many open wounds, too many conflicts of interest. And a complete break with the United States would be just as dangerous, losing access to technology, defense cooperation, investments, and key markets. Besides, Trump has always had a soft spot for Modi. That counts for something these days. In the end, everything suggests that Modi isn't seeking to choose sides, but rather to flex his muscles and demand respect. Almost every other country, except China and India, has bowed without resistance to whatever Emperor Trump dictates. Modi seems determined not to. The risk, of course, is that his balancing act could spiral out of control. If Washington feels India is leaning too far toward Moscow and Beijing, it could toughen sanctions and cut strategic cooperation. And if Beijing interprets Modi's smiles as weakness, it might seize the chance to push further with its agenda in Asia and the Pacific. So yes, India has multiplied its Russian oil imports and takes part in China-backed forums. That's undeniable. But for now, Modi's favorite partner remains Washington. Not out of affection, but because that's where the keys are to: technology, investment, security, and diplomatic backing. And those are things Russia and China simply can't provide. That's the situation. But now the questions are for you. Do you think India is really turning toward China? And Russia? Or is it just bluffing to squeeze concessions out of Trump? Can it maintain strategic ambiguity forever? Or will it eventually have to choose a side? As always, thanks for being here. Until next time.